Hello, everyone. So what happened to the world champion, Gukesh? That's what we're going to try to understand in this video. The grandmaster with white is Abdusattorov, a very strong grandmaster. In fact, he is currently leading the Tata Steel tournament. It's the tournament that Jasser has been following for several days. And Abdusattorov starts with the pawn of 4. The world champion Gukesh replies with e5. Knight f3 attacks, knight c6 defense. This is classic. Bishop b5, the Spanish opening. And in the Spanish opening, there's this possible exchange of the bishop for the knight, which will radically change the position because the pieces are exchanged. So it creates imbalances and also imbalances of pawns, because depending on whether you recapture with the b7 pawn or the d7 pawn, it will double the pawns. So it's an exchange that will be very interesting for strategy because, to create plans, you need imbalances. And precisely black player 6. They encourage this exchange. Why? Because in reality, this immediate exchange, although possible, doesn't bring any real advantage for white. For example, if we take the knight, which didn't happen in the game, black can recapture with the pawn from d7 to c6. Now, I know that many players will tell you it's better to recapture toward the center with the pawns, but here we recapture toward the outside to open the bishop's diagonal, but especially the file for the queen. Because if the knight comes to take the pawn on e5, the queen can capture that pawn by making a fork. So, as we've seen with this push to a 6, taking the knight on c6 doesn't bring any advantage for white. So often white retreats to a 4. They let this threat linger for a little while longer. Black play knight f6, attacking the pawn on e4, and it's up to white to leave a pawn. They do a kingside castling. Because if black take the pawn, which did not happen in the game, there is often a counterattack with rook to a1 on the file. Or even preceded by the pawn to d4 to try to open the file for the benefit of the rook, and to the detriment of the black king. That's why, in the game, black choose the close variation of this Spanish opening. They play bishop e7. And here the continuation is often rook e1 or pawn d3. But Abdusattorov will choose to exchange the bishop for the knight. He creates this imbalance. So, the pawn on d7 recaptures outward to give the diagonal to the bishop and the file to the queen. The pawn on e5 is in danger, but so is the pawn on e4. So white will first solidify their pawn on e4 by playing d3. And now black have to defend the pawn on d5. So how to do it? There are several moves. We can consider bishop g4 to pin the knight on f3. But this bishop can be attacked by the push of the pawn h3. But there is also bishop d6 or queen d6 to defend the pawn of 5. But if the world champion chooses knight d7, this move may seem strange. And yet it's the first move in the theory on this variation. Why? Because the idea is to free the pawn on f7, so that this pawn on f7 can come to f6, solidify the pawn on e5, and relieve the black pieces from defending the pawn on e5. The knight will be able to reposition itself. There can be maneuvers like nc5 and ne6 afterwards. And it's not a problem for black to play f6 and weaken these white diagonals. Why? Because white no longer have the bishop of white square. They exchanged it on c6 in the opening. And black are the only ones who still have the bishop of white square. So if black place their pawn structure on dark square S, in reality they won't have any problems on the white squares thanks to the presence of their bishops. White play nc3, kingside castling, bishop 3, rook 8, a4, a5, and now rook 1. So this little move might come as a surprise. Rook h1, but the idea for white might be a bit later, maybe to push f4 or in any square to try to create play on the king side, so the king shifts over to stay out of the way in the corner. Black play bishop d6 now, and now knight to e2. Why this knight move to a2? It can serve several purposes. The knight can actually aim for the square f5. For example, play knight g3 and approach black's castled position with knight f5. Then when the knight is on g3, it will defend f4 well. We might also consider the d4 push preceded by c3, or if the knight f3 moves, the f4 push. So this retreat of the knight to e2 is more of a maneuver to direct it toward the square f5. And then the position remains very flexible. Black are going to play knight f8, it frees the bishop on the light square, and the knight can reappear. For example, on e6 or on g6. Knight g3, as expected, black plays c5, and now knight d2. The knight frees the pawn on f2, which can now go play f4. As for the knight on d2, it can move to square c4, an interesting square where it can put pressure on the pawn on e5. Black play knight e6 to prevent this push to f4 and to control this square well. But as a result, the knight blocks the bishop's defense of the square on f5, and the white knight can get closer. The bishop retreats to f8, knight c4, and this move f6 that we talked about. And this will allow me to talk a bit about the play of colors. Because the exchange that took place in the opening, the bishop of white squares for the knight, will give white an advantage on the black squares. They no longer have the bishop of white squares, that's true, but they have one more piece to fight on the black squares, since the knights can fight on both colors. So the idea for white is to erect a defensive pawn structure on white squares, we'll see. They will even play the pawn on b3 to try to muzzle the opponent's light-squared bishop as much as possible, to condemn him to his diagonals. And white must seek to engage in combat on the black squares. And that's what they're going to do with the coup, queen g4. The g7 summit is under pressure, and this pin is a threat. Knight h6, check. Because this king h8, we have knight f7, the king-queen fork. So black plays king h8, just as white had played king h1, ultimately, to try to make people forget about the king. Now the queen retreats to g3 to avoid any problems with the bishop being directly across. And black plays b6. Look at how black establishes their pawn structure on the dark squares. They are also solidifying to withstand the pressure from the white pieces, which will attack precisely on those dark squares. And by putting all the pawns on dark squares, they leave the light diagonals open for their bishop. White is doing the same with a pawn structure. Soon there will be b3, which will be very solid on the white squares. But here, Abdusattorov is trying to break through black's defenses. He's going to play h4. For example, you could try to play h5, h6 to attack the g7 pawn. Black play g6 to try to push back the knight, but the knight comes in on h6. Black play queen d7, the knight comes back to g4 to attack the f6 pawn, which was weakened by the g6 pawn push. And if the knight takes, of course, there is a fork, which is why black will come to defend with bishop g7. f3. Bishop a6, putting pressure on the knight, b3. This is what I wanted to tell you earlier with this very solid pawn structure on the white squares. And black also have a very solid pawn structure on the black squares, even though it's true they played this move g6. Rook a8, h5, we want to break through the opponent's defenses. If black pushed g5, we could take advantage by playing h6 here. The bishop moves away and we win the pawn on f6. That's why black can't. They solidify with g5. They take on h5. So they win a pawn, that's true, but black's pawns are weak. Their doubled pawns still isolated. Knight h6 is played. Bishop takes c4. Pawn takes. There black cannot tolerate the fact that the knight prevails in f5. So they're going to exchange it. Bishop takes h6. Black plays rook g8. They seize the column. Queen h2. Rook g6. We attack the bishop, queen 3-5 to defend it. And knight to f4. So what do black do? With this knight on f4, they of course attack the queen. They attack the g2 pawn twice. So that forces white to take. Black takes back. They have doubled pawns, that's true. When we look at the structure of the black pawn, it's no longer fragmented because there's a group of pawns here. Two doubled pawns isolated here and an isolated pawn here. But black have obtained the semi-open g-file to attack the backward pawn, g2. And if we play the pawn g4, there will be the en passant. In fact, that's what white will do anyway. They will play g4 in the game, because the threat posed by black is to play queen g7. Attack g2, threaten rook h6, the pin, bring the other rook back to g8. There will be too many games on column g. So here, Abdusattorov is playing g4, en passant, and king g2. The idea is that the pawn on g3 blocks black's play on the file. Queen d4. That ties down the rook to defending the f2 square, so for example, you can't play. Rook h1. Rook e1 is played, king g7. And here Abdusattorov plays e5. The rook and the queen support. He tries to open the e column precisely to obtain a column to play with his rooks. Rook h6 attacks the queen, who is moving to g4, to thwart. Rook g6, queen f5. And look closely at the rating bar. Look closely at what's happening. Gukesh will play the move here, rook g5. And you can see that all of a sudden the evaluation bar jumps to plus 16 for white. That means the position is completely lost for black. So what happened with this move, rook g5? That's what we see in the video. Yes, Gukesh made a big mistake, a terrible mistake, almost a beginner's mistake by playing rook g5. He gives up the protection of his pawn on f6, so queen takes f6 check, fork, he's going to lose the rook with no compensation. Here, Abdusattorov will have an extra rook and the attack. That's why Gukesh resigns immediately. A game that was very strategic with play on colors and pawn structures that were established based on this play of colors. We were approaching a conclusion with the opening of the e-file up until that fatal mistake. So what should black have played? Of course, not rook g5. The computer suggests several moves. For example, it even suggests capturing, actually, because after queen takes, the queens are exchanged, and after rook takes, you can play rook f8 to attack the queen, rook e7, check, king g8, and as you can see, the position is balanced. So after this rook g5 mistake, by the way, you should know that Gukesh had just over 8 minutes left on the clock. We're at move 36. As soon as you reach move 40, there's a bonus time added, about 30 minutes per player, plus an increment of 30 seconds per move. So he doesn't really have a big time problem. Gukesh, and he will even take 3 minutes to play this rook move, g5. A terrible mistake, point f6. So as you can see, for now, Abdusattorov is leading the Masters tournament with 4.5 points out of 6, followed by Sindarov and several players with 3.5 points. Vincent Keimer, the German, Hans Niemann, the American, and Vladimir Fedosev. In the Challengers tournament, we can see that 2 players are currently in the lead. The Frenchman Marc-Andrea Morezzi and the Azerbaijani Aydin Suleymanli. They are followed by the American Andy Woodward and, of course, the Argentinian Faustino Oro, from whom we've already seen some beautiful games, some great attacking games. You can click on the link above if you want access to the playlist for this Tata Steel tournament. And then leave me likes, comments, share the video, and support the channel. Goodbye, everyone.